My dear friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to this ICA webinar, which is being conducted on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. regularly without a break, without any interruption. We have been fortunate to have the excellent leadership who have been guiding us through these webinars. And we have done 3 modules of cardiovascular monitoring, starting with ECG, central venous pressure, arterial blood pressure, pulmonary artery pressure, cardiac output. Today, we are going to deal with advanced modes of monitoring, which is mentioned in the slide: PCO2 gap and lactate, central venous oxygen saturation, mixed venous oxygen saturation, cerebral oximetry, and how to assess the microcirculation. The second international and the 12th National ICA Conference will be held on 17th, 18th, and 19th December this year. It will be a virtual, not a virtual conference, but it is a traditional conference. Please join us. And the registration details are mentioned here. 17th, 18th, and 19th are the dates for the ICA annual conference this year. So with this, I would like to invite my colleagues to take over. Dr. Arjun Alva, Dr. Ratan Gupta, Dr. Shiva Prasad will be moderators, come panelists. And we have eminent speakers from Narayan Hrudayalaya, Dr. Chetan, Hemant, Vimal, and I'll be also speaking in this forum. So I'll hand over the mic to Dr. Ratan Gupta to initiate the session. Dr. Ratan Gupta is a senior consultant in cardiac critical care at Narayan Hrudayalaya, extensively experienced in critical care, and he is associated with a lot of teaching activities. And over to you, Ratan Gupta.
Thank you, Dr. Muralidhar. And thank you, ICA, for giving me this chance to be part of the ICA webinar. And I would like to welcome my colleagues, Dr. Arjun and Dr. Shiva Prasad, who are working as intensive care specialists at Narayan Hrudayalaya. And I would like to introduce the speakers. Dr. Vimal would be speaking first. He will be talking on PCO2 gap and lactate. And then Dr. Chetan will be discussing about SCVO2 and mixed venous oxygen saturation, cerebral oximetry by Dr. Muralidhar, and assessment of microcirculation. Dr. Hemant would be speaking on that. I would like to introduce Dr. Vimal. He's working as a consultant critical care at multi-speciality hospital Narayan Hrudayalaya, Narayana Health City, Bengaluru. And he's got extensive experience in critical care. And welcome, Dr. Vimal Bharadwaj.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for the introduction, sir. Happy Deepavali, and very happy to be a part of this academic program. I'm just sharing the screen. Is the screen visible? Presentation visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah. So the presentation is on PCO2 gap versus lactate. Basically, on a daily basis in ICU, we get a lot of patients in shock. Shock is a life-threatening scenario wherein every minute counts. So it's basically loss of homeostasis, wherein there is a mismatch between oxygen delivery and consumption. So in order to aid early diagnosis and also help in prognostication, as well as to see whether the treatment is being given in the right terms, we need a marker. So so let's understand what are the characteristics of ideal marker and why do we have so many markers, and what are the limitations, particularly with the lactate, and where exactly PCO2 gap stands. So the characteristics of ideal marker, it should be highly sensitive, it should be specific as well as safe to do, not very invasive per se. And the marker should be repeatable. There should not be any erroneous values when you repeat from one value to the other. And more important, it has to have a good prognostic value. And it should be able to delineate different types of shock. And for the clinician, it's very, very important to have a real-time marker so that there is a minimal lag period between the clinical scenario and the marker value. Then only it will be very useful in any clinical context. And as usual, it should be cost effective. So let's see where the markers stand. So why is the need for so many markers? On clinical examination, basically clinical examination, the shock characteristics are essentially the same, which runs across various shocks, except for a few differences. So it is marked with cold peripheries, decreased urine output, altered sensorium, and probably breathlessness, pulmonary edema, and all these are the different clinical characteristics of shock. But there is a lot of inter-observer variability. And clinical examination might not tell what is the kind of shock. So there are a lot of limitations with clinical examination. That's why we have these markers. SCVO2, SVO2 that Dr. Chetan will be covering. So let's understand, where does lactate stand with the characteristics of an ideal marker that I just illustrated. So the lactate, as you can see, I've given a list of causes of hyperlactatemia. Lactate not only gets generated because of anaerobic metabolism, but also it can be associated with various diseases, malignancies, drugs, and inborn errors of metabolism. And even gut can be one of the major sources of lactate production. So as one can see, it is not a very specific marker for shock, and it is not a real-time marker. So there has to, so there is a significant clinical, there is a significant lag period between the clinical scenario and the lactate getting built up. So that's why I have not yet got that ideal marker. So after understanding the limitations of clinical examination and lactates as markers, so where does this PCO2 gap stand? And do we have an answer for an ideal marker? This presentation has been taken from this excellent article, which the reference I have quoted in the last slide. I would advise all the listeners to please go through this article. It gives in and out about PCO2 gap very beautifully. It was published in Journal of Thoracic Surgery, 2019. So what is PCO2 gap? It is nothing but difference between the venous PCO2 and arterial PCO2. So in a clinical scenario, one can get this by just doing an ABG and a VBG, an arterial blood gas and a venous blood gas together, and see the difference between venous PCO2 and arterial PCO2. To understand this PCO2 gap, one needs to know how carbon dioxide is produced. So the factors governing the carbon dioxide predominantly depends on global oxygen consumption. So one can get this idea. So in an anaerobic metabolism, there should not be any carbon dioxide production at all. In anaerobic metabolism, the pathway shifts, wherein there is an excess production of protons, which gets combined with bicarbonate, and thereby leading to the production of water and carbon dioxide. So in anaerobic metabolism, the pathway of carbon dioxide generation is completely different from aerobic metabolism. So the carbon dioxide production depends on the respiratory quotient and the global oxygen consumption. So R is nothing but respiratory quotient, which depends on the substrate of food that is being utilized. That is either it's carbohydrate or lipid or protein. And carbon dioxide is transported in three forms. This is important because viewers can get this question, why not oxygen difference? Why only carbon dioxide difference? So to understand this, we need to know how carbon dioxide is transported. So carbon dioxide is transported in dissolved form as 10%. Compared to oxygen, it is dissolved form of carbon dioxide which plays an important role in the kinetics of carbon dioxide. And since carbon dioxide is approximately 20 to 30 times more diffusible than oxygen, so the carbon dioxide directly correlates with the carbon dioxide content in the blood. It has got a linear relationship with the content of carbon dioxide in the blood. As one can see, there is a linear relationship. If one can remember the oxygen dissociation curve, it has got a sigmoid relationship, but in the carbon dioxide curve, it has got a linear relationship. So the PCO2 gap essentially reflects the carbon dioxide content in the blood. And the determinants of PCO2 gap can be elucidated with the Fick's equation. That is, the consumption of a substance is nothing but the product of the blood supply across the organ and the arteriovenous product concentration difference. So using this Fick's equation, the PCO2 gap has got an inverse correlation with or inverse relationship with cardiac output. This is the most important point and the crux of the whole presentation. PCO2 gap has got an inverse relationship with cardiac output. That means to say, whenever cardiac output increases, so it will wash out the carbon dioxide and the PCO2 gap will come down. So if cardiac output is compromised, then PCO2 gap will increase. So this is the most important clinical decision asset that any physician would like to have during his practice. So we all try to improve the cardiac output. Whenever the patient has got shock, we try to improve cardiac output either by giving fluids or by giving inotropes to increase the cardiac output. So basically PCO2 gap is a very specific marker in order to ascertain whether the tissue circulation is happening properly or not. Or in other words, whether the cardiac output is good enough to remove the carbon dioxide. So this is so now after understanding the relevance of carbon dioxide gap and its impact on cardiac output, once we see different types of shock, so in cardiogenic and hypovolemic, in cardiogenic, obviously there is a poor cardiac output. In hypovolemic, there is dehydration, there is a fluid deficit. In both these scenarios, there is a very high carbon dioxide gap. And when it comes to other types of shock, the carbon dioxide gap might not be high. So this is an important tool in this critical decision making, whether to give fluids or not, or whether to increase cardiac output or not. If one looks at the lactate, irrespective of type of shock, lactate increases, whether it be a cytopathic shock or a distributive or anemic or cardiogenic. But carbon dioxide gap, it will decrease during a low cardiac output. In distributive shock or septic shock, if the cardiac output is high, the carbon dioxide gap will be low. And if the cardiac output is compromised because of relative volume deficiency or because of septic cardiomyopathy, then carbon dioxide gap can increase. Although it is written high over here, it can vary according to the clinical scenario. That's why carbon dioxide gap helps us in deciding this very important question to see whether the patient, where exactly the patient stands in the Frank-Starling law or Frank-Starling curve, whether the patient is fitting onto the ascending loop wherein it makes sense to increase the cardiac output by giving fluids or increasing the inotropes, or is he on the flat part of the curve wherein these interventions are not actually important or are not actually useful. This is very, very important part of clinical decision, because the more we give, we can cause more harm to the patient. If we increase inotropes or if we give more and more fluids, it can lead to venous congestion and it can lead to adverse outcomes, as shown in this excellent paper in NEJM, wherein more was found to be harmful. So as a physician, although carbon dioxide gap might not be effective in determining whether there is a tissue hypoxia or not, but it is an excellent tool in determining whether the circulation is optimal or not. So I'm very happy as a clinician if the lactates have gone up, and I do not want to give fluids blindly. I do not want to give inotropes blindly. So carbon dioxide gap will help me make this crucial decision whether to give fluids or to increase cardiac output or not. And based on the echo and other bedside tools, I can determine whether to give fluids or should I increase the cardiac output. So one might say that, yeah, it doesn't give a wholesome idea of whether the patient is, whether there is a tissue hypoxia setting in. To answer that query, we can have one more important parameter derived from the PCO2 gap. As I initially told you, PCO2 gap depends on oxygen consumption. So if we negate oxygen derived variables from the equation, then with the derived equation, that is PCO2 gap divided by arteriovenous oxygen content difference, we will be able to detect tissue hypoxia. So the magical number is 1.4. I forgot to tell you the PCO2 gap normal range, it is 6. I apologize for telling the value so late. PCO2 gap, the normal value is less than 6. If it is more than 6, that means to say there is a compromised cardiac output. For this delta PCO2 gap divided by arteriovenous oxygen content difference, the normal value is 1.4, less than 1.4 millimeter of mercury per ml. So I repeat again, delta PCO2 gap divided by the oxygen content difference between arteriovenous circulation is used to detect tissue hypoxia, and PCO2 gap is used to detect the cardiac output and adequacy of circulation. So now coming to the clinical scenario. So for example, you got an ABG which is showing a high lactate and you are still in doubt. Then one can look at the delta PCO2 by CAV oxygen gap. And if it is more than 1.4, that means to say there is tissue hypoxia. And if PCO2 gap is more than 6, that means to say there is an inadequate circulation. So it makes sense to give inotropes bar fluids based on the clinical scenario. If the PCO2 gap is less than 6, then that means to say that there is tissue hypoxia, but there is no point in increasing cardiac output. Cells are unable to extract the oxygen. It is most probably a cytopathic shock, which is causing this sort of or there could be anemia. So this sort of a shock is being caused by inability to extract the oxygen, or there is a compromised oxygen delivery without compromising on the cardiac output. For any marker, there has to be pitfalls. So there is nothing like ideal in this world. So PCO2 gap has got its own its own pitfalls. So let's understand where you should not use PCO2 gap. Basically, PCO2 gap has not been found very useful in hemodilution. That's why in post-cardiac surgery cases, it was not found to be reliable. And in hyperventilation, especially, so they did an experiment in normal individuals going for hyperventilation, and they found that PCO2 gap was erroneously high. It is probably because of the shift of the carbon dioxide curve to the right, but it is not very useful in patients who are hyperventilating. And also errors in sampling the blood gases. This is very important. There can be an inadvertent air bubble going inside the ABG syringe. All this can cause erroneous carbon dioxide values. So at that time also one can get false PCO2 gaps. And most important, there are few conflicting studies on prognostication. PCO2 gap has not been found to be an effective tool when it comes to prognostication. So if the PCO2 gap is more than 6, I cannot tell this to the patient relatives that patient is really sick or patient might not do well. There are various studies with lactate, wherein lactates of more than 4 were found to have an independent association with mortality. But PCO2 gap, I cannot be very certain. That's why still there is a questionable role in prognostication. So I will just summarize my talk on PCO2 gap. So basically PCO2 gap, it is an excellent marker at looking at the circulation. It is not good at detecting tissue hypoxia. So if PCO2 gap is more than 6, then it gives a hint that the circulation is not adequate and we need to improve the circulation by probably increasing inotropes or by administering fluids based on the clinical judgment. And PCO2 gap doesn't detect tissue hypoxia. In order to detect tissue hypoxia, one needs to do delta PCO2 gap divided by the arteriovenous oxygen content difference. And if the value is more than 1.4 millimeter of mercury per ml, that means to say that there is tissue hypoxia. I hope I have made it very clear where exactly one needs to use PCO2 gap. So it is an excellent tool in determining the adequacy of circulation. And with this valuable information, I would still regard it as a marker which is almost an ideal marker which aids in the clinical judgment. Thank you for the opportunity. And these are the references.
Thank you, Vimal. That was a very lucid presentation. We'll take the question and answers for you at the end of all the presentations. I invite my co-panelist, Dr. Arjun Adva, to introduce the next speaker. Arjun.
Good evening, everybody. So the second topic for the cardiovascular monitoring is mixed venous oxygen saturation versus the central venous oxygen saturation. Although we don't use it that often today in today's clinical scenario, let us hear from Dr. Chetan, who has been a consultant with Narayana Health City for a few years now. As a young budding consultant. Let's hear from Dr. Chetan more about SVO2 versus SCVO2. Over to you, Dr. Chetan.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Chetan.
Yeah, Good morning, good evening, everybody, and happy Deepavali to all. And Dr. Vimal has covered most of the markers for the tissue hypoxia. And now I am going to cover on mixed venous oxygen saturation and central venous oxygen saturation as a monitoring tool to detect hypoperfusion and tissue hypoxia. Though we are not using it very frequently nowadays, it's worth noting its benefits and pitfalls and what are the areas which it can be used. Yeah, again, shock is defined as a global tissue hypoxia secondary to imbalance between systemic oxygen delivery and oxygen demand. So there is probably an imbalance which is happening with the oxygen delivery and the oxygen demand. And venous oxygen saturation represents this relationship between the oxygen delivery and the oxygen demand. So mixed venous oxygen saturation is a measurement of whole body, what is the mismatch which is happening between the whole body oxygenation. And venous blood taken from the pulmonary artery catheter tip to sample the deoxygenated blood entering the pulmonary artery before passing through the lung will constitute the mixed venous oxygen saturation. So before going to understand what is the role of mixed venous oxygen saturation, let's understand the physiology which is behind this monitoring of mixed venous oxygen saturation. Delivery of the oxygen will depend upon the two things. We all know that it is based on, one is arterial content of the oxygen, and then next is cardiac output. Arterial content of the oxygen will depend again on three factors, that is hemoglobin, oxygen saturation, and PaO2. PaO2 might not contribute that much, and cardiac output will be depending upon stroke volume and heart rate. So this is the equation. Delivery of the oxygen is equal to cardiac output into 1.39 into Hp into saturation of oxygen plus PaO2 into 0.03. Dissolved part of the oxygen plays a very little part. It's more of cardiac output and probably hemoglobin and saturation, which will determine the end organ oxygenation, which might be. So what is the oxygen extraction? Oxygen extraction is nothing but the demand divided by delivery. So what is the demand which is happening and what is the delivery of the oxygen which is happening? So VO2, that is demand, which is equal to cardiac output into CaO2 minus CVO2, that is arterial content, oxygen content of the artery and oxygen content of the vein. So which could be further simplified, and DO2 is equal to cardiac output into arterial content of the oxygen. So we could further simplify this equation as SaO2 minus SVO2 divided by SaO2, which if you consider cardiac output as significant, if you are taking hypoxia as one of the things. So extraction ratio will roughly be like 100 minus SVO2. So normal extraction ratio of the oxygen is around 0.2 to 0.3. So mixed venous oxygen saturation should be corresponding to around 70 to 80%. And increase in the oxygen extraction, which is feature of a flow insufficiency. That is, oxygen is not properly being delivered. May it be the flow which is not proper, or the content of the flow is not completely adequately oxygenated. And low extraction, that is high SCO2, might be seen in diffuse tissue oxygen demand, or it might be also due to inefficient oxygen utilization and some sort of pathologically increased cardiac output, that is if there are increased shunts which are means showing our cardiac output has been increased, or in some types of hyperdynamic circulation. So what will the components which causes decrease in the mixed venous saturation? Okay, so main thing is the oxygen delivery is not proper, that is anemia, hemorrhage, hypoxia, hypovolemia and heart failure. Or if there is increased consumption, that is agitation, pain, fever, shivering, respiratory failure, and increased metabolic demand, which might be seen in sepsis or in hyperthyroidism cases. And we can also see an increase in the mixed venous saturations. That is, we might be increasing the delivery of the oxygen. That is, we are giving oxygen therapy, blood transfusion, intravenous fluid, and increase in the cardiac output by using of inotropes. Or there might be decrease in the oxygen utilization, particularly if we are giving anesthesia, sedation, analgesia, patient who are kept on mechanical ventilation, patient who are hypothermic, hypothyroidism, or there might be pathological decreased O2 extraction in the end organs, which can be due to increased shunting, cell death, or due to cyanide poisoning. So once we have known the physiology of these things, what are the challenges and how to overcome these challenges in monitoring of mixed venous oxygen saturation? Again, because mixed venous oxygen saturation has to be obtained from a pulmonary artery catheter, and we are exposing the patient to risk associated with pulmonary artery catheter. So these includes arrhythmia, pulmonary infarction, embolism, bleeding, pneumothorax, or line-related infections. And nowadays, there are not too many indications for insertion of PA catheter, and only to insert a PA catheter to measure mixed venous oxygen saturation might not be justified. So now weather and central lines are most commonly used. So whether blood obtained from a central line, that is IJV, or subclavian can be used as a surrogate marker. So that is saturation of a central line. In normal circumstances, so these are some of, in normal circumstances, the mixed venous oxygen saturation is slightly more than the central venous oxygen saturation in normal circumstances. This relation is reversed in shock or in some of the critically ill patients. This is one of the study which was done in our center, which showed a close correlation, and it can be interchanged. That is, central venous oxygen saturation and mixed venous oxygen saturation can be closely interchangeable. And study population there most probably post cardiac surgery patients. There is another study which also shows that it can be interchanged, but there are other similar studies which are showing that there is a very poor correlation of central venous oxygen saturation and mixed venous oxygen saturation, particularly in patients with post-pediatric surgeries, post-pediatric cardiac surgeries, aortic valve surgeries, and in sepsis. So, as a rule, we don't have an exact evidence of interchangeability in all circumstances, but particularly in early stages of sepsis and sometimes in post-cardiac surgeries, or even during the intraoperative period, we could slightly interchange these things. If we are not able to take a mixed venous oxygen saturation, it would be better we use the central venous oxygen saturation. And now, once we have taken these things, and what values do we need to target? Again, SCVO2 is 2 to 4% lower than mixed venous saturation in normal population, but in critically ill, it is higher than mixed venous samples. So whatever targets which were previously prescribed, where mixed venous saturation should be around 65 to 75%, and central venous oxygen saturation of more than 70%. But these things can be altered. So in chronic cardiac failure patients who are cardiac failure or who are slightly decompensated, but doesn't require that much aggressive treatment, in those patients, they are already been compensated and the oxygen extraction ratio will be high, and you might get a lower mixed venous oxygen saturation, but we might not need to treat them very aggressively. And liver failure patients, in liver failure patients, there will be n number of shunts, photosystemic shunts, which might be happening, and these photosystemic shunts might inadvertently raise the baseline. So for these patients, if central venous oxygen saturation or mixed venous oxygen saturation of 70% might still be abnormal, and in hyperthyroidism patients also it might be altered. So rather than using one particular value to target our resuscitation, it would be always be preferable to use the trend. So we have to see the trend. If there is a particularly drop in the trend, then we might need to think of what resuscitation we should give to this patient, either fluids or volume based on other clinical criteria. So, and again, whether high SCBO2 is desirable. And again, this was the study which was done in later stages of septic shock, which showed that the levels of central venous oxygen saturation max of around 85% was seen in the non-survivors compared to 79% in the survivors. This means that even very high central venous oxygen saturations might not also be good, particularly patients who are very sick, and it shouldn't give us a level of comfort. Okay, this might be because of increased shunting which happens across the periphery, which might show a very high values. And then once we have noted, okay, what values to target, now we thought that rather than targeting a single value, we should more commonly prefer doing the trends of the either mixed venous oxygen saturation or central venous oxygen saturation. Then whether is it beneficial to do a continuous monitoring or intermittent monitoring should be sufficient. Okay, what are the gadgets which are available for continuous monitoring? A central venous catheter with the added capability to monitor central venous oxygen saturation. Probably we call it as Percept. And there are some fiber optic wire which can be passed through a standard distal CVC port. So you might not have thought that patient might need a central venous oxygen saturation initially, and you might have inserted central line for some other purpose. And when you think that okay, resuscitation might be required, these fiber optic wire could be inserted easily. And intermittently, what we can do is analyzing the blood sample taken out of the CVC. Okay, whether continuous monitoring is beneficial compared to intermittent monitoring. Bundle compliance was better when continuous monitoring was used. That is, previously we had the sepsis bundles needs to be achieved with this particular time. So the bundle compliance was better when we were using continuous monitoring. Targets were achieved earlier, and changes in between the sample time can be picked up by the continuous monitoring. But whether it really translates to mortality benefit is still a question. Most of them were not able to prove that the mortality was different, or the patient who were monitored with continuous central venous saturation survived better. So they have done multiple studies which have shown that mortality is more or less the same even if you do continuous monitoring or even if you do intermittent monitoring with a good clinical examination in it. So with these things, okay, what we learned was whether to do mixed venous or we can use it as a surrogate of central venous oxygen saturation, whether we need to do it continuously or intermittently, or what value to target, and after this, what are the clinical indications? There are not very many clinical indications which absolutely require monitoring of the mixed venous saturation or central venous saturation. So particularly in cardiac failure patient, diagnostic, prognostic and therapeutic qualities in the critically ill patients with acute myocardial infarction might be there. So very low mixed venous or central venous saturations in the initial period of acute myocardial infarction might have diagnostic and prognostic abilities. And patient with low mixed venous saturation in early stages might be considered in shock even though if their BP and heart rate are normal. And also in settings of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, central venous oxygen saturation of more than 72% during the CPR is highly predictive for return to spontaneous circulation. Okay, it might help to predict it. And also, only thing is that chronic heart failure patients might get accustomed to low central venous values. And then coming to trauma patient, whether it is useful to use continuous central venous oxygen saturation in trauma patient. So venous oxygen saturations are superior in predicting blood loss compared to conventional parameters that is heart rate, BP, and urine output. But if you are using other dynamic monitors, dynamic monitors are doing equally well compared to venous saturation. And post cardiac surgery also superior to the conventional parameters, that is mean arterial pressure, heart rate as a qualitative warning sign. Superior to mean arterial pressure and heart rate as a qualitative warning sign for substantial hemodynamic deterioration. And it also have a predictive value of SCO2. It doesn't have a predictive value of mixed venous saturation to cardiac output. It is mostly inconsistent. And continuous mixed venous saturation enables early diagnosis of occult bleeding, or in some patients who have been adequately filled could show poor tolerance of moderate anemia. Patients have been filled, but still mixed venous oxygen saturation is low. These patients might benefit from blood transfusion. And decrease in the mixed venous saturation values during the weaning from mechanical ventilation are predictive of extubation failure. And during the post cardiac surgery, goal directed approach intraoperatively and also during post operatively reduces the complication of hospital length stay and mortality. So strict adherence to predetermined hemodynamic goals, that is cardiac index, mixed venous saturation, oxygen extraction, urine output, so results in lesser occurrence of organ dysfunction. But the risk of involved in repeated intervention to attain these therapeutic goals may not be applicable to all patients. And whether only using central venous oxygen saturation or mixed venous oxygen saturation as an independent predictor of improved outcome is still not very clear. It could be used along with other parameters to achieve a goal, and probably if all the goals are being achieved, probably then there is a lesser occurrence of organ dysfunction. And again, in sepsis, the mixed central venous oxygen saturation came into limelight with the River et al. Trial, which was first done in sepsis patient. So early goal-directed therapy, which showed a very good mortality benefit, and it includes fluid resuscitation, a target of central venous pressure, CVP, and vasopressors and targets for mean arterial pressure, and also with SCO2 monitoring, blood transfusion was advised. But subsequent trials fails to demonstrate that central venous oxygen saturation monitor will benefit. Even without central venous oxygen saturation monitors, patients were recovering if we had used like fluid resuscitation, central CVP monitors alone. And resuscitation with other protocols also improved outcome. And lactate-based resuscitation, that is resuscitation with lactate clearance, are being much better compared to resuscitation based on mixed venous oxygen saturation or central venous oxygen saturation. And recent guidelines, that is in 2021 guidelines, has removed the recommendation on central venous oxygen saturation. So limitations of whether using mixed venous or central venous oxygen saturation. Mixed venous requires a PA catheter, and central venous oxygen saturation can't be used as a surrogate in all these situations. And one more thing what we need to keep in mind is central venous oxygen saturation does not take into account of coronary sinus saturation, which may be of value in cases of myocardial dysfunction, either due to cardiac cause or myocardial dysfunction which is happening due to sepsis. And it's a global marker, and regional change in the hemodynamics might not be easily picked up. If some organ dysfunction is happening and the changes to pick up on mixed venous oxygen saturation might be very low. And lack of therapeutic guidelines and cost effectiveness issue questions the clinical use of continuous measurement of central venous oxygen saturation or mixed venous oxygen saturation. In conclusion, I would like to conclude that trends of central venous or mixed venous saturation, whatever if you are monitoring, might be beneficial rather than targeting one absolute number. Continuous SCO monitoring may have shown to adhere to benefits in adhering to the bundles and achieving targets earlier, but still mortality benefit has not been proven. So resuscitation using lactate as a marker appears to be simple and easy to interpret, and adequacy in the resuscitation can also be achieved. But if hyperlactatemia is there, whether to transfuse or not, if anemia is causing, it can be used along with other surrogate markers or other clinical monitors to know the adequacy of the resuscitation. Presently, not very good role in the ICU, but in some difficult cases, if you know what all the things which need to keep in mind, probably we can use as an adjunct to know the adequacy of the resuscitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chetan. That was a wonderful presentation. Dr. Ratan, do you want to introduce the next speaker, please?
Yeah. Dr. Shivaprasad is there? Yeah. Would like to introduce Dr. Muralidhar, who doesn't need any introduction basically. He's senior consultant and professor of anesthesia and intensive care. He's got a huge number of publications, and he's got 30 plus years of experience in anesthesia and critical care. He's dean and academic head at Narayan Hrudayalaya. He will be talking to us about cerebral oximetry today. Dr. Murali, please.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. You are audible.
And my slides are visible?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Ratan, for the introduction. I am greatly honored to be part of this symposium on cardiovascular monitoring. Without much ado, I'll go on to the subject proper. I have no disclosures. To begin with, I'll be illustrating two cases who underwent cardiac surgery. This is a 68-year-old man who underwent off-pump coronary artery bypass grafting. Serum creatinine was elevated. He received 3 grafts, and post-operatively, he woke up confused, and he had focal neurological deficit in the form of right hemiplegia. And the CT scan showed infarcts, as is shown in the picture on the right upper corner. This patient stayed in the hospital for 3 weeks and made a gradual recovery, and was discharged with a residual weakness of the right lower limb. Second is a case of a 71-year-old male person who underwent elective CABG. 3 grafts are put. He woke up with confusion and hemiparesis, and with ventilatory support, he improved, and he made a complete recovery in next 48 hours. This patient had a preoperative narrowing of the carotid arteries, but they were not flow limiting. But despite this, he had some neurological insult. So the incidence of neurological insult following cardiac surgery in terms of neurological deficit is about 2%. Though we say it is 2%, it is 100% for the patient and patient family. It adds burden to the society in terms of taking care of a patient who has a successful operation but has come home with a weakness of one of the limbs. Is there anything we can do to prevent this? The answer is probably yes. One sort of answer is to monitor the CNS. The central nervous system can be monitored looking at the metabolic integrity or the functional integrity. We will be dealing today with this part of the monitoring of the brain function during surgical procedures. The human skull is translucent to infrared light, and intracranial, intravascular regional oxygen saturation may be measured non-invasively with transcranial near-infrared spectroscopy. The cerebral oximetry monitors the anterior watershed regions. This is the anterior cerebral artery region and the middle cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery. We are placing the sensor at this region, and you can know what is happening to the oxygen saturation at this part of the brain by the use of cerebral oximetry. The advantage of cerebral oximetry is that it is non-invasive, continuous, and real-time. The sensors are placed on the forehead as is shown here. There is a self-adhesive patch affixed to the glabrous skin of the scalp, which transmits light through the underlying tissues to the outer layers of the cerebral cortex. The light penetrates the bone to reach the cerebral cortex, and we have an emitter. We have an emitter and two sensors. One is a shallow sensor and the other is a deep sensor. The shallow sensor is placed about 1.5 centimeters from the emitter, whereas the deep sensor is placed about 5 centimeters from the emitter. And the light passes through the superficial layers and the deeper layers. And by subtracting the absorbance of the light from the shallow detector from that of the deep detector, we will get the oxygen saturation of the deeper structures beyond the scalp. And there are several manufacturers. So at least 4 manufacturers are there for cerebral oximeters. Each of them have a different algorithm. For example, you have the emitter here and the 2 sensors here. Whereas in this model, the sensors are very close. And here there are more than 1 emitter. So the algorithms used by each of these oximeters is different, which makes that these machines cannot be used interchangeably. And if you're using one machine in the theater and different machine in the intensive care unit, we cannot interchange the readings and derive a valuable conclusion. The oximeter works on the Beers-Lambert principle, which is shown here. The absorbance of the light by the deoxyhemoglobin is different from that of the oxyhemoglobin, and infrared light of various wavelengths can be used. In this particular model, which is shown here, there are 5 wavelengths which are being used. The normal cerebral oximetry value is about 70%. And baseline value less than 50% represents reduced brain tolerance for hypoxemic insult. And clinically important decrease of less than 20% is considered to be significant. So the same thing is mentioned here. What are the acceptable values? Acceptable values between 60 to 90. And if it comes below 60, you have to take notice of that. And if it is 50, you must certainly intervene immediately to prevent any further neurological deterioration. If there is cerebral desaturation, this is the algorithm. The head position is verified. And if the patient is undergoing cardiac surgery, the cannula position has to be rectified if there is any issue with that. The mean arterial pressure has to maintain 65 millimeters or above. Systemic oxygen saturation should be corrected. And PCO2 is maintained between 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury to prevent the changes in the cerebral oximetry because of changes in the PCO2. Hemoglobin should be corrected. And the cerebral oxygen consumption can be decreased if the patient is having seizure activity. This is the classic depiction of the cerebral autoregulation. We have the lower limit and the upper limit. Between the mean arterial pressures of 50 and 150, the cerebral blood flow is maintained constant because of the cerebral autoregulation. These values of 50 and 150 have been determined in healthy volunteers, and the cerebral oximetry has an important role in determination of cerebral autoregulation in a given individual. If you look at this pictorial representation, this is the flat portion of the cerebral autoregulatory curve, and with the blood pressure, mean arterial pressure coming down less than 50, there is decrease in the blood flow, and with the blood pressure, mean arterial pressure greater than 150 millimeters, there is increase in the cerebral blood flow. This is managed or achieved through vasodilatory or vasoconstrictive reserve at the lower end or the upper end of the autoregulatory curve, respectively. What happens to patients who have diabetes, long-standing diabetes or long-standing hypertension? This autoregulatory reserve is changed, and when we administer vasoactive agents such as especially vasodilators such as nitroglycerin or sodium nitroprusside, these autoregulatory limits may be altered, and in a given particular patient, the autoregulation curve may vary from classic depiction of autoregulation with unknown limits of autoregulation, and this can be possibly determined by the use of cerebral oximetry. The autoregulation is also very patient-specific. This is the classic autoregulatory curve, the one in the dark red bar, and this is the autoregulatory curve in patients with various disease conditions. So you can see that what is good for one patient may not be good for the other one. This is depicted, illustrated in these two pictures, two patients. We have taken two patients, one patient. This is the mean arterial pressure on the horizontal axis and the regional oxygen saturation on the vertical axis. As the blood pressure came down in this patient, there was not much change in the cerebral oximetry, which means that the cerebral autoregulation was well maintained up to a point of 40 millimeters of mercury mean arterial pressure in this case. As compared to this patient, whose oximetry values decreased promptly when the mean arterial pressure decreased below 70 millimeters. So this patient's autoregulatory limits have been deranged, and hence this patient is likely to behave differently. That's what happened. Patient need ventilated support for 7. The ICU stay was prolonged, and ventilated support also was proportionately increased. So if you derive a correlation between the mean arterial pressure and the cerebral oximetry, we can derive what is called cerebral oximetry index. As long as this index is near 0, the autoregulation is maintained, but beyond, as it goes away from 0 on either side, the autoregulation will be disturbed. The most important use of the cerebral oximetry is in thoracic aortic surgery, where there is a risk of stroke is substantial, and to prevent cerebral insult, that is to have cerebral protection, we resort to selective antegrade cerebral perfusion, where oxygenated blood is pumped into the right axillary or right subclavian artery to maintain the cerebral perfusion during deep hypothermic circulatory arrest. These patients are undergoing the surgery under cardiopulmonary bypass using deep circulatory hypothermic arrest. So the circulation is stopped. To be able to protect the brain, we use what is called as antegrade cerebral perfusion. The oxygenated blood is pumped into the right axillary or right subclavian vein, and this will perfuse the brain during the period of circulatory arrest. But the assumption is that the circle of Willis is patent, but it is observed that in about 20% of the population, circle of Willis may not be functional, in which case, though we are perfusing the right side of the brain, the left side will not be perfused, and there will be cerebral desaturation on the left side of the brain. So this can be easily detected using by cerebral oximetry. And if there is desaturation on the left side of the brain, that dictates that we should insert a cannula in the left common carotid artery as well and perfuse that part of the brain which is devoid of blood supply during antegrade cerebral circulation. So this has been amply demonstrated in several studies. This is one such study. The association of decreased cerebral oxygenation is associated with poor outcomes in aortic heart surgery. And even preoperative determination of cerebral oximetry may be predictive of the outcomes. If the cerebral oximetry preoperatively is decreased below 50%, their outcomes, survival probability is much decreased. In two groups of patients, this is with patients with Euro score of less than 5, these patients with Euro score less than between 5, more than 5. So in both groups, the preoperative cerebral oximetry may be a risk predictor in these patients. When we are doing carotid endarterectomy, again, cerebral oximetry can be used. The results are similar to that obtained by transcranial Doppler and stump pressure measurements. This study mentions that cerebral oximetry can be used to decrease cognitive dysfunction following surgery. So if you take a surgical population, the insult of neurological insult causing definitive neurological deficit is about 2%. But when it comes to neurocognitive, it can be as much as 30 to 40%. So this is a screen of an advanced hemodynamic monitor where we are monitoring both sides of the brain, as well as the tissue oxygen saturation is measured using sensors placed in the legs here, feet, and the other parameters are being shown here. This may be done in high-risk patients. And this is the hypothetical relationship between the tissue desaturation and clinical outcomes in patients monitored with cerebral oximetry. If the cerebral oximetry shows decreasing trend, if you restore the saturation by maneuvers, which I had mentioned in the algorithm, not only the brain can be protected, but the other organs which are not being monitored may also be protected. This is another cerebral function monitor where it's a comprehensive monitor which shows not only the pulse oximetry on the left side, but also the capnography, the patient state index, and the cerebral oximetry values left and right here, and also the area under the curve is also mentioned here. Area under the curve is the duration and degree of desaturation below 60%, which is calculated and readily given as a reference value for the clinician. This one is a thermal diffusion cerebral blood flow monitoring device. There are two thermistors. These are NVC procedures. This thermistor is inactive. This only senses the temperature change. And this thermistor is active, which is heated to about 2 degrees greater than the body temperature. And the amount of heat needed to increase the temperature by 2 degrees as compared to this is correlated with cerebral blood flow, and we can determine the cerebral blood flow using this monitor. Coming to the application of regional tissue oximetry, this includes knowledge about tissue balance, tissue oxygen supply balance, need for blood replacement, assessment of volume status, detection of perfusion cannula malposition, and guidance of supplementary cerebral perfusion during systemic circulatory arrest, as I have mentioned in the previous few slides. In India, we had a near-infrared spectroscopy focus group, which recommends that cerebral oximetry is needed for patients undergoing aortic surgery under deep hypothermic circulatory arrest with antegrade cerebral perfusion to identify inadequacy of circle of Willis to safeguard this left-sided cerebral perfusion. This is a class 1 indication by this group. In conclusion, Cerebral and tissue oximetry are simple and attractive ways to measure regional oxygen saturation, regional oxygenation, but data are insufficient to recommend cerebral and tissue oximetry as a standard of care monitoring for all patients. Patients undergoing cardiac surgery and carotid endarterectomy are more likely than other patients to benefit from cerebral oximetry. Emerging data suggests that tissue oximetry provides complementary information for patients in hemorrhagic shock and for pediatric patients with impaired intestinal or renal perfusion. By serving as a surrogate for cerebral blood flow, cerebral oximetry may offer a clinically feasible method to monitor cerebral autoregulation. With this, I thank you for your patient hearing and hand over the podium to Dr. Ratan Gupta. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. That was a very lucid presentation, and it throws light on how important oximetry monitoring is in cardiac surgery, especially. I now invite Dr. Arjun to introduce the next speaker. The questions will be taken after the end of the fourth session.
So the last topic for today is assessment of microcirculation. Will be presented by Dr. Hemant. Hemant is senior consultant working with NH City. Is also this running secretary of Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine Karnataka chapter. Over to you, Dr. Hemant, sir. Please carry on with your talk.
Good evening, everybody. Hope I'm audible.
Yes, sir, you can. You're audible, sir.
Okay. So, welcome you all. Very good evening and happy Diwali. Today, I'll be talking to you all regarding microcirculation, how to assess microcirculation, and I'll be introducing you to one concept called as tissue red cell perfusion. So, this is what we see many times in an ICU, though the picture of the leg that I've given is slightly an exaggeration. Nevertheless, in patient with septic shock, we try fluids, vasopressors, and on the monitor, we get a decent looking blood pressure, right? And then we say that after fluids and vasopressors, patient's hemodynamics is holding, right? We broadly, we use the word hemodynamics, to tell that we have achieved what we call a normal looking blood pressure on the screen. Well, what is a crux here? The problem here is when we resuscitate a patient, either by volume or vasopressors, what exactly we want? We want to address the tissue oxygen debt. That means we want to improve the perfusion at the tissue level, right? So obviously, because we cannot measure the flow at the tissue level, we use a very poor surrogate called as blood pressure, right? Because we assume that if we optimize the blood pressure, we are optimizing the flow. This is an assumption which does not hold good most of the time, right? And the next thing is that when we get a decent looking blood pressure on the monitor with a vasopressor, we assume that we optimize the flow. Now, next thing we look further into is optimizing the flow at the tissue level by directing and optimizing the flow in the macrocirculation, right? By using, say, flow track or PA catheter, etc. Again, we assumed here that by optimizing the flow in the macrocirculation, we are actually recruiting the perfusion at the microcirculation. And further assumption that actually this meets the metabolic demands of the cell. But unfortunately, all this is an assumption and does not hold good at the tissue level. This, I call it as loss of hemodynamic coherence. Most of the time in shock patients, right, there is loss of hemodynamic coherence. That means when we recruit macrocirculation, it does not necessarily recruit the microcirculation. And when even if you might recruit the microcirculation, it does not necessarily translate into addressing the tissue debt at the cellular level. Another twist to this is how different organs also behave in shock. Again, when we resuscitate a patient, we assume that if the flow of blood is optimal in one particular organ, we assume that it is addressing the tissue debt at all the other organs. This is most of the time not happening at the bedside. This, I call it as discordance among the different organs. Why there is discordance? Because different tissues have different oxygen extraction and different oxygen demand. So when we resuscitate patient in shock, we assume a lot of things, and we assume that what we do to one organ ultimately helps the other organ. So basically, we need to have what is called as something like a functional microcirculatory parameter. That means a parameter which gives a number based on which we can address it and optimize the microcirculatory blood flow, and ultimately to address the oxygen debt at the tissue level. That means what we are looking at is microcirculatory targeted resuscitation. Okay, so with this, I'm introducing to you to a concept of micro tools with which we'll be using a HVM. HVM is a handheld vital microscope. We all are aware of the first generation of HVM that was used for the orthogonal polarization spectrum. Currently, we are using the third generation HVM, that is the, for this. And Micro Tools is basically an algorithm-based software which is incorporated into this handheld vital microscope. So let's get going. Okay, so to make things simple for the trainees, handheld vital microscope is a device, right? This is a third generation device. And Micro Tools is the algorithm-based software which is incorporated into this device, and from which we get a parameter called as tissue red blood cell perfusion. Okay, this is a parameter with which hopefully we will be able to address the microcirculation. Again, remember, this is currently not available commercially. This is a concept which probably over a period of time may be available at the bedside as a point of care tool. Okay, now let's come to the basics again. Now we know that oxygen transport by oxygen in the red blood cells in the microcirculation. This is what we'll address now. Okay, we have optimized the macrocirculation. Now we want the oxygen to get transported from the microcirculation to the tissue level. So how does this oxygen transport happen? It happens mainly by two ways. One is by the convection and another is by diffusion, right? And I mean convection, it is convection of the oxygen carrying red blood cells, okay, in the microcirculation. This is convection. The next thing is diffusion. Diffusion is diffusion of oxygen from the red blood cells to the mitochondria. And only when these two things happen, we can assume that we have achieved oxygen debt at the tissue level. Now, what determines the convection of oxygen carrying blood vessels? It is the RBC flux. Okay, RBC flux is basically to do with the rheological properties at the tissue, at the microcirculation, and the flow properties of the RBCs. And when we come to the diffusion of oxygen from the red cells to the mitochondria, what we are actually talking is the functional capillary density and the hematocrit at the capillary level. I will address the concept of functional capillary density in my subsequent slides. Hope I am clear till now. Now, this is exactly what the Micro Tools as a software does. Okay, this will look into this various parameters attached to this And based on the algorithm, this micro tools will assess various parameters and will give us one value that is called tissue red cell perfusion. Now, let's come from bench to the bedside. There are a lot of microcirculatory alterations that happen in patients with shock. And we have broadly categorized into these type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. Type 1 usually happens in patients with septic shock. And there is heterogeneity of the capillary density. And also there is altered blood flow. There could be shunting, and there could even be clots. And we all know in advanced septic shocks, the microcirculation will be clogged with blood clots. And that's the reason. And this is type 1 usually happens in patients with septic shock. Type 2 microcirculatory alterations happen in patients with in wherein there is reduced oxygen transport due to hemodilution, usually due to excess of volume resuscitation. Type 3 defects usually happen because of stasis of microcirculation and tamponade. Stasis happens usually when we use very high doses of vasopressors. Right? When we use very high dose of vasopressors, no doubt we get a decent looking blood pressure on the monitor, but this will impact the microcirculation because there is stasis. When there is stasis, you can't expect it to address the oxygen debt. Next comes tamponade. Tamponade usually happens because of the increased venous pressure. Again, a fallout of very aggressive volume resuscitation. And type 4, usually this is due to tissue edema and low functional capillary density. This usually happens in patients with tissue edema, where there is capillary leak, endothelial damage, endothelial edema. Typically, what we see in dengue patients are, pancreatitis, burns, etc. In these patients, there is low functional capillary density. That means we are just not talking about capillary density. We are talking about functional capillary density. Means the part of the capillaries which are actually taking part in the flow. Now, let's see how different this is. When we measure a flow in a single artery, it's very simple. You have one exit, one entry, and one exit, say radial artery or say femoral artery. Red blood flows from one end to the other. So how do you measure that flow? It's simple, because the flow is dependent. There's a linear displacement over time. So what we do, we take a time integral, okay, and then we calculate, then we look at these the cross-sectional area. Then it becomes very easy to calculate the flow in the large blood vessel. But what happens in microcirculation? In microcirculation, unfortunately, this is not the case, because just imagine microcirculation is a three-dimensional bunch of capillaries stacked together, right? Some are arranged in parallel, some are arranged in series, right? So you cannot apply, and there is no one single entry or exit. Blood can flow in any particular direction, and this is extremely dynamic. The flow of the direction of blood flow in the capillaries could change depending on various parameters. So obviously you cannot use the concept of linear displacement. So here what we are looking at is volume displacement over time. And this is the difference of assessing the flow at the microcirculation versus assessing flow in the large blood arteries, right? See, this is the picture which will help you to understand this concept. If you see the first picture, okay, it's a named artery, okay, you have one entry and one exit, right? There is a displacement. And the next picture that you see is the capillaries, right? And if you see, it is totally haphazard. This is just a representation from the dark field microscope image, okay, to make you understand this concept. And as you see, the blood flow can be in any haphazard direction. So obviously, so what principles you apply for measuring the flow and in the larger vessels, you can't apply at the microcirculation. And based on everything that the microtool studies, this is the algorithm the microtools uses to get that parameter, which we call it as tissue red cell perfusion. To make it simple, if you see, it has various parameters like hematocrit, the flow, and the displacement. So basically, this slide is not meant for memorizing. This slide is meant to understand the concept that what are the things that get into measurement of tissue red cell perfusion. Now, let's come to the applicability. In fact, whatever theory we speak, ultimately we have to be, we have to understand how we can use at the bedside, and what is the effect of different treatment modalities on microcirculation and possibly on the tissue red cell perfusion. Fluids. We are great fans of giving fluids in shock, but you should understand fluids will benefit only if you give early, when the microcirculation can be recruitable. Okay, as we know, as the shock is delayed, in this late shocks, when patient presents to you very late, giving fluids might not recruit the microcirculation. The next thing, and of course, when you give excess fluids, okay, though, as I told you, there are two aspects to it, okay, convection and diffusion. The fluids might in fact improve convection, but that comes at a cost. That is, it hampers the diffusion. And more so if you give late, diffusion, the problems with diffusion happen, is so much that the benefits of convection gets nullified. What about vasopressors? Again, vasopressors will benefit only if you use initially, right, wherein you can improve the convection. That means the microcirculations in this are recruitable. See, in late shock, microcirculation cannot be recruited, but if you give vasopressors in very high doses at that point, you may get a normal looking blood pressure on the screen, but it will choke the microcirculation. There will be stasis in microcirculation. So ultimately, you will not be able to recruit the microcirculation. Now, coming to diuretics, what does diuretics do? Diuretics actually cause an increase in the functional capillary density. So when you give diuretics, what happens? The tissue edema comes down. So when the tissue edema comes down, what will happen to the diffusion part? The diffusion is better. So oxygen is able to diffuse better from the red cells to the mitochondria. So also when the edema comes down, the amount of the capillaries which are actually taking part, what we call as a functional capillary density, improves, right? What about blood transfusion? Blood transfusion can recruit the microcirculation. The hematocrit, as we know, is one of the factors for which will improve the diffusion part. But again, you need to understand that you can't go on increasing the hematocrit beyond a level, because you could have clogging of microcirculation, Role formation of blood cells, and it might choke the microcirculation. An interesting thing is about patients on VA ECMO. We put the patient on VA ECMO to optimize macrocirculation, but effect on microcirculation also is important. This is one instance where you can use tissue red blood cell perfusion to say whether VA ECMO is actually benefiting the patient. And in those patients where tissue red cell blood perfusion actually improves when we put a patient on VA ECMO, that may also mean the patient is improving and might very soon come out of ECMO. That's just one of the practical applications that we look at in patients whom you put on VA ECMO. Well, for all those students, trainees who are switched off or were exhausted or just couldn't concentrate, I just want you to look at this slide. If you could understand this slide, right, that means you've probably understood everything, right? So just concentrate on this slide for the next 2 minutes, and hopefully you'll understand everything that I wanted to tell you in the last 15 minutes. On the x-axis, you see it's volume resuscitation. We assume that in the extreme left corner, that patient is volume responsive. On the y-axis, if you see, you have a hard vertical line on the left side, that is tissue red blood cell perfusion. And on the right side, you have the dotted line on the y-axis, which represents the cardiac output, right? Now let's see how it works. When you give fluids initially, if you see here, when we give fluids, the cardiac output improves. So does the tissue red blood cell perfusion, right? That means the macrocirculation is getting recruited, and microcirculation also is getting recruited, and the diffusion component of the microcirculation is benefiting the patient. Well, only up to a limit. You see, a middle, there's a vertical line in the middle, after which things change. What has happened? If you continue to persist with volume resuscitation, no doubt the cardiac output does improve a little. If you see, I don't know if you're able to appreciate this, this particular second half of the curve. You give volume, the cardiac output does increase a little, but that comes at a cost. The tissue red cell perfusion actually is dipping down. So that means beyond a limit, if you say that I'll give fluids, so I'm using a flow track or whatever device, I give fluids and cardiac output is improving, that means if you assume that it is benefiting the patient, you may be wrong, because no doubt the cardiac output improves when you give fluids after some point, but that comes at a cost because the diffusion component of microcirculation gets hampered so badly that that does not translate into addressing the microcirculation and the tissue oxygen debt. So this is the utility of, this is where actually the tissue red blood cell perfusion comes into market commercially as a point of care testing. This will probably help us and avoid the harm that you could do with trying to resuscitate somebody with the help of only cardiac output devices. Now, what's the future that we're looking at? The future we are looking at is, combining this tissue red cell blood perfusion with oxygen saturation within the visualized RVC. That's the next generation that we are looking at. And another thing that we are looking at is, this is mainly an experimental tool now, applying sublingual topical nitroglycerin at the sublingual level to estimate whether we could recruit the microcirculation with nitroglycerin. One thing you need to understand that this HVM that we are using is mainly used in the sublingual circulation. And the current evidence suggests that the microcirculation at the sublingual the part is very similar to what we see in the gut and the kidneys, right? The microcirculation, the kidneys and the gut. So naturally, we can use sublingual as a tool to extrapolate and say that the microcirculation at the kidney level and the gut level is probably, it's going to correlate. But again, it's an experimental tool, right? We need to see whether ultimately we will have it as a point of care device. Well, take home, no doubt this is a new, very fascinating thing that, to understand the whole concept of microcirculation, what possibly, the tissue red blood cell perfusion will hold in the future, because this uses MicroTools, which is a software which combines both the diffusive and convective components, both for, when we address the tissue perfusion. And tissue red cell perfusion is a very promising point of care testing for microcirculatory based resuscitation. Thank you and Jai Hind. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Hemant. That was a wonderful presentation. New concept to a lot of us. Anybody wants to ask any questions, our panelists and the speakers will be more than happy to answer your questions. The chat box as well, you can ask your questions in the chat box.
Yeah, you can simply unmute yourself and ask questions as well. Meanwhile, I have one question for Hemant. Hemant, what about improving the colloid osmotic pressure and building up the protein levels and trying to improve the thing so that it doesn't extravasate and you don't get the tissue edema setting in? What do you think about the protein building up?
Well, actually, any patient in a hypercatabolic phase, either in sepsis, burns, or RTA, whatever it is, what happens is the glycocalyx takes the hit. So once the glycocalyx takes a hit, whatever fluids we give, the amount of fluid that escapes is much more. So irrespective of whether you give colloid or a crystalloid, it makes its way out when the glycocalyx gets destroyed. So obviously, when you give colloid, the colloid gets accumulated in the interstitial level. So it might borderline help convection, but diffusion is something which will get badly impacted, and probably it might not address the oxygen rate.
Dr. Murali sir, we
Yeah, tell
recently
me.
had one patient who underwent CPB and apparently a straightforward surgery, no intraoperative events. But post-operative patient has neurological problems. He basically is convulsing. That's why I was interested in knowing the role of cerebral oximetry as a routine tool in all patients who undergo CPB. Because there are a lot of things which can go wrong. Air embolism is one thing, thromboembolism is another thing. Sometimes the aortic cannula may not be directed properly. So even though you're not operating on the arch and ascending aorta, still you can have patients ending up with hypoperfusion, especially to the innominate artery. So what do you have to say on that?
You're right. Thank you for that question. Actually, normally what we go by is by blood pressure and heart rate normally in any case. And if the blood pressure and heart rate is good, we think that everything is fine, but that may not be so, because in patients who have atherosclerosis of the ascending aorta, or they have impaired autoregulation as a result of long-standing diabetes, cerebral atherosclerosis or carotid stenosis, and these particulate emboli, all these things will play a part in causation of the cerebral injury in these patients. So as of now, there's no indication for the use of cerebral oximetry on a routine basis for all patients, because it's a class 2 recommendation. So there's no class 1 recommendation for all the patients. What we have to do is we have to have a good, good hemodynamics and a good technique for cannulation and maintenance of hemoglobin and hematocrit and other general measures should be perfectly done, which we automatically will take care of all the problems which can arise as a result of minor mishaps or accidents. So there is no class 1 recommendation for routine use. That is the thing, because there are studies which have said that even when they use cerebral oximetry, the cognitive dysfunction was not totally abolished, and vice versa.
Yeah, microembolization is something which we really can't help. But this, apart from putting a arterial side filter for air and this thing, but a macro perfusion event probably can be helped by using a cerebral oximetry. That's what I was thinking about. But I'm sure that the cost and other things would be
There's no firm recommendation, so we cannot say that it has to be used for all patients. It's not like pulse oximetry where we need it for all patients. It's not like that.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? Please come forward.
I just wanted to ask a general question for anybody who can answer. See, we always go by saturation and oxygen tensions, oxygen saturation and oxygen tension. Shouldn't we be looking at oxygen content rather than tensions and oxygen saturation? Because we need to know what is the oxygen delivery, which depends upon oxygen content and cardiac output. So how much of oxygen is going, we should know rather than saturation and pivot. Pivot and saturation is okay, but it does not tell us how much is actually going to the tissues. Anyone can answer.
I think that's a very valid question. What probably I would do on the clinical side is, in case I have difficulty at any level, a patient is not doing well, patient is not maintaining the hemodynamics, or he is requiring more than appropriate inotropes, I would definitely go in for a cardiac output in that situation. Otherwise, I think routine usage of cardiac output monitor probably would be costly and probably not indicated. In sicker patient, definitely yes.
Sure. Somebody else wanted to say,
Yeah. So there are two aspects to it. One is the first of all, what actually benefits the tissues is the free dissolved oxygen in the blood. And that is what we measure when we measure the PO2. So, so it's more easier to measure the tension of oxygen in the which is dissolved in the blood, because that's what is easily available to the tissues.
Yeah, it is easy.
And the
Yes.
saturation is something which we can easily measure, content by capacity, which does not depend on hemoglobin at all. So, that's more, easy and pragmatic way of looking at the whole thing.
No,
So
it is
that's-
easy, not pragmatic. I do. It is easy because we can
Yeah.
measure it easily, but content means you have to know, content includes the hemoglobin bit of it.
Yes, yes, yes.
So hemoglobin also is important. Especially I'm asking this because we see cyanotic patients who are walking around and they may be little breathless now and then, but otherwise they are walking around, and if they you see the saturation is 85 or PO2 is only 30 or 40, but oxygen content is reasonable because that's why they are able to carry on. But this is not so in clinical scenarios, clinical situations.
Yeah, probably I think the acute desaturation or decompensation is what probably.
Acute, there is no chance for the body to produce more hemoglobin and RBCs. So there, there's a problem there.
Yeah, probably if they're acclimatized over a period of time, I think the symptoms might be less obvious. If you don't get time to acclimatize, I think you're in trouble.
Yeah. Vimal is there. Vimal, you want to say something on this?
I'm not seeing Vimal.
Again,
No,
sir,
no.
the
Yeah,
patients
yeah.
that we're mentioning, cyanotic heart disease, etc., they're all chronic patients, probably
No,
over
no,
a period of time.
yeah, exactly. The body is adapted by increasing hemoglobin.
So the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, it shifts, the tissues extract the oxygen better. So probably it's more to do with the changes at the tissue level. I really do not know by increasing, say, for example, if somebody is going at high altitude for, say the Himalayas, etc., what matters is how fast or how slowly you go. The more slowly you go by taking breaks, your body gets used to it. It's more to do with no doubt the hemoglobin level goes up, but ultimately the tissues which adopt much more than anything else.
Yeah. These patients have polycythemia as a compensatory mechanism. So they are able to maintain the oxygen delivery to some extent.
One more drawback, if I can speak.
Yeah.
So basically, the oxygen carrying capacity, even if we measure, it might not truly reflect what the cells are receiving, especially in compromised cases because of the tissue edema and because of glycocalyx dysfunction. So we might not be able to determine what exactly is the oxygen that the tissues are getting. We might get an idea about the overall oxygen content, but it might not truly reflect what's at the cellular level. So that might be one of the disadvantages as well.
No, that
Even if we
applies
have
to tension as well.
Yes.
Same problem will be there for tension.
Yeah, that is an overall problem. That's why even if we have a mechanism to get it on a real-time basis, but it might not add on to the wealth of information in treating the patient.
Actually, I also, my question was also based on the fact that in patients who are in ECMO, we accept saturation of 88 to 90, 92 very easily without batting an eye. But if the same thing happens in a routine patient, we get worried.
Yeah.
88 to 92, we accept it and think that it's fine. But in a routine case, we don't accept it.
Yeah.
But why so?
But because the oxygen, anything more has been found to be not so good.
That
Not,
that is equally applicable to other patients, not only ECMO patients.
ECMO, I do not know whether there are any studies which have been done, sir.
No, if you look at the guidelines, they want only 88 to 92% saturation.
Sir,
yes,
may
sir.
I?
They
May I?
don't, they don't want more than 92%.
Sir, in ECMO, probably on the saturation and everything, we are mostly under control. So maintaining saturation of 88 to 90 would be adequate. We would be delivering adequate oxygen to the tissues.
Why not for other patients? That's my question.
Why not for the other patient? Because as we see the curve, so the fall in the oxygen saturation, oxygen content would be dramatic when we go down less than 90.
Same
That
thing will
means,
happen to ECMO patients also.
uh,
Why
it's
it should not happen?
It's an alarm sign, sir. It's an alarm sign, more of an alarm sign that if it is falling below 90, it may not take more time to come to 70 or anything. But in ECMO, we are still in control, that we are able to maintain that saturation 85 to 90, we will be in control. But in rest of the patient, we may not be in control of those things.
Chetan, one more thing, in COVID patients, we have accepted saturation of 85,
So,
90, but it's a controlled situation, as you rightly put it.
yeah, it's a controlled situation. So,
Sir,
yeah,
can I
tissue
try?
perfusion might be still better. Tissue oxygenation will be still better with 85. But only thing is that we have kept a safety level of 90. And if it comes to below this thing, the
Okay, why not in ARDS patient on ventilator? You get worried if it comes below 90.
No.
We target around 85 to 90, sir. That's
85 to 90. That's all.
No, the targets are less for ECMO patients rather than for other patients.
Sir, are we talking about veno-venous ECMO? Because veno-venous ECMO, whatever the FiO2 or whatever you attempt, your saturations are not going to go beyond 88, 90. In that context,
okay. Then why are you accepting 88 there and not in other patients?
Because that is the maximum you can achieve on veno-venous ECMO. So you just achieve 88, 90, and that is adequate for tissue oxygenation. Whereas we are doing a VA ECMO, probably it's a different recommendation. There you can achieve a higher PO2. But of course, it has VA ECMOs have got its own side effects and complication instance. So VV ECMO, I think that is what is achievable. Even if you increase that to 100%, the PO2s are still going to be around that. It is not going to go further. Probably that might be the recommendation for ECMO.
No, my intention is that we should also pay attention to content, because we never pay attention to content. We just go by PO2 and SaO2. If it's okay, just leave it like that. We never look at the content.
Yeah.
We also have to look at the content.
I think, keeping the hemoglobin up, I think, is equally important other than the PaO2s. Your hemoglobin content and overall cardiac output has to be maintained in VV ECMO.
Yes.
Probably, I think lactate might help there.
Yeah.
Yeah, any signs of end-organ dysfunction, probably then we might be thinking in terms of improving the content. If there are no signs of end-organ dysfunction, probably we might be just sufficient with the saturation and tensions. If it is getting decompensated, if the end-organ dysfunction is appearing like lactates or SeO2 is very low, then probably we might consider, okay, improving the content of the oxygen, not as a routine.
I think the way forward is going by protocols and maintaining a crit of around 30. And additional this thing, if there's a problem with the overall content delivery or the end organ indicators are showing, for example, lactate is on the higher side, probably you may target it a little further higher. Otherwise, crit of 30 initially and maintaining adequate PO2s in the 60s, 70s, targeting a saturation of 88, 90 could be good in this patient.
So, are there any more questions?
I'm not seeing anything on the chat box. I think someone has posted the link for certificate.
That the organizers will take care. And now I think if there are no questions, can I conclude the session by thanking all the participants, and my heartfelt thanks to all the faculty members who have taken trouble to be present, and such excellent presentations were made. Vimal, Chetan, Hemant very nicely presented. Ratan, Arjun and Shiva for joining us. And thank you ICA for giving the opportunity. And Venkatesh and Sanish were with us to aid us with the technical issues. And thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, sir.
Happy
Thanks for the
Deepavali,
opportunity.
happy Deepavali, and good luck.
Same to you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.